point, incredibly popular man in America. I believe at this point he'd run for president, I think 5 times, maybe 4. He's a great speaker. He's well known. He's well respected, and he's incredibly religious. The prosecution, the defense, brings in a man by the name of Clarence Darrow, who is not only a very, very talented lawyer, he also knows science. What is going to occur at what's referred to as the Scopes Monkey Trial is people who live in small town America and people who are of faith feeling alienated and rejected by the birth of what they call the liberal media. Because the liberal media at this period represents things such as the New York Times. It's a publication coming from a major city where they run editorials in their newspaper such as this, saying, "Thou shalt not think," essentially arguing that people in small communities who are people of faith are morons who are stuck in a different century, and that people in New York City and people who represent science, these are the voices of modernity and rationalism. And yeah, every time William Jennings, it ends up the trial of being a face-off between William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. And when William Jennings Bryan is brought up to the witness stand and Clarence Darrow asks him questions about cell structure, about mutations, about all the sort of building blocks of science, the only thing that William Jennings Bryan can answer with is quotes from the book of Genesis. And yeah, if you want to fight science, you have to know science. Yeah, if stories about Adam and Eve and creation are the only thing you have to attack somebody who's using evidence concerning cells and mutations, yeah, you're gonna look like a fool. And the media starts mocking this and starts a phenomenon in American culture that still defines us to this day of what I would call the culture wars. And what holds it all together, folks? Sports. For myself, what it means to be American and my version of the American dream is having a car, having freedom, and going out and driving that car. For many other male contemporaries, what they would say is that they might agree on the car, but they also want sports. And the reason why something like sports are important to the American experience is prior to the birth of sports stars such as Babe Ruth, when an American worker went to work on a Monday morning, they had nothing in common with their coworker and they had nothing to talk about. What started occurring during this period, let's say hypothetically, you're a German immigrant who works in a factory, and on that factory line next to you is a French immigrant. And traditionally, French people and German people, they hate each other. They speak different languages. You have different traditions. And so, yeah, you don't ever talk to each other. You just ignore each other. Now with Babe Ruth and the birth of the radio, you have something to talk about. And yeah, baseball becomes America's pastime because it gives Americans, for the first time, something in common, something they can talk about. It gives young people something to dream about and to talk about. If you're a young person in the 1920s, then you can rattle off every single batting average that Babe Ruth or anyone else ever had. And if you own a radio that you probably bought on credit, if your family cannot afford to go to the baseball game comes to your living room. And yeah, you feel connected with the rise of popular culture, mass media. Babe Ruth is your hero. Your kids start flocking to the films and going and seeing little penny movies. And yeah, Monday morning, that German worker and that French worker, they got nothing else in common, but Babe Ruth is the glue that holds America together. Oh, goodness. The problem when Americans are caught up in the Roaring '20s, part of the idea of isolationism after World War I was, since we were never really threatened during World War I, was that participating in that war had been a great mistake, and that the United States should go back sort of George Washington style, focus only in our nation. If you have a military, have it here to protect our nation, and withdraw from the rest of the world. The problem is in the 1920s, as Americans are getting caught up in isolation sentiment and consumer culture. Some very complicated things going on in the world because World War I did not solve anything. The Treaty of Versailles simply created new problems. In 1922, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan, all three of which had been friends and allies during World War I, came together to sign a naval treaty in Washington, D.C. What this was the United States and Great Britain now recognizing Japan as a major world power, but also making sure that Japan would stay subordinate to the United States and Britain, particularly since the main goal of American and British foreign policy up at this point for a good 40 or 50 years had been tapping into and controlling the markets of China. As if Japan becomes a powerful force, they're fearful that Japan might squeeze the Americans and the British out. What they create is a formula saying a 5-5-3 ratio with navies. That for every 5 battleships the United States has, Great Britain also gets 5 battleships, and the Japanese can only have 3. What this does is that allows Japan to start building up its military to feel like a world power, but also realizes that, yes, they will always be a subordinate world power to Britain and the United States. And this starts creating resentment within Japan because the only reason why Japan had been on Britain's side during World War I is they were promised an empire throughout Asia. And when they did not get that and were then put in a subordinate position, tensions start to rise in the Pacific. 1924, we talked about this last week, when hyperinflation hits the German economy. And the Americans step in with our bailout plan called the Dawes Plan. In many ways, it makes sense in the short term. The short-term impact is going to be amazing. But what you are doing is the exact same thing we did prior to the early 1870s when the Vienna stock market crashed out. Because you are not just having a global economy of trade. What you're doing is you are interlinking global finance, which means if something goes wrong in one country, is it brings down every other country. 1925, European powers come together and sponsor what's called the Locarno Treaty. Now that things are starting to settle down in Europe and Germany was starting to have some economic growth again, this was European leaders saying, we pledged that World War I was going to be the war to end all wars, and let's sign a treaty saying that European powers will never go to war with each other again. And while that treaty looked nice on paper and represented a certain segment of European thought, it also kept a status quo in check, saying that the settlements of the Treaty of Versailles is the way the world is going to run now. And the treaty also kept out the United States and the Soviet Union, which very similar to the institution of the League of Nations. Without the Americans in it and the Soviets in it, it's simply a debating society between different rival imperial powers of having empire gaining up with other empire to try and control other empires and keep them in check. And without those sort of non-imperial voices that Americans and Soviets might bring to this institution, it's a debating society of imperialist powers. The great problem, 1926, Germany is brought into the League of Nations. This allows Germany to have a certain sense of international respectability and status once again. But the problem with it is that, yes, by now joining the League of Nations and saying that the future will be based upon a world without war, is Germany has just accepted absolute defeat. And that Britain and France and other powers of World War I who would side against Germany, yes, that defeat will be permanent. And that Germany, they talk about ideas of collective security. They talk about ideas of peace. What that means in reality is all of Germany's neighbors now utilizing the principles of an institution that was created to maintain world peace, to yes, constantly keep Germany in check and keep Germany surrounded and make Germany very nervous. To react against this, the United States, as well as 60 other nations throughout the world, come together in the year 1928, signing what's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. What the Kellogg-Briand Pact does is, for the first time in modern human history, is it makes war illegal. And the United States signs on to that. And the Soviet Union signs on to that. And Germany signs on, and Britain signs on, and France signs on. In 1928, when they say there will never be any future wars, and anyone who starts a war will be held legally accountable for those actions, that will be considered what we call in modern times a crime against humanity. Yes, this pact still exists. It's still in the books. It's just there's not an international court to enforce it. And we'll talk about one of the great challenges of this. This pact is brought into play in 1928 to try and keep Germany under control. It's going to cause a number of problems for major world powers after World War II. And what goes up must come down. We had some positive things to say for a little bit, and now let's destroy it all by crashing out Wall Street and getting some water. Bo Schweikert, hands in, talked about the crash of Wall Street, but neither one of them went into too much detail with it. The main reason being is that anyone who says that they have an answer of exactly what triggered the collapse in 1929 with Wall Street was either delusional or a liar. Historians and economists are still debating this out. But what we can do is we can identify some general economic trends of the 1920s that help to lead to complications of the economy, and then we can identify a spark that actually sparks this off. Throughout the 1920s, the great problem was that you were expanding out an economy based upon consumer credit. And when people are using consumer credit to purchase things that they don't need, and eventually that credit starts running out. If a consumer loses their access to purchasing power, that means that products you're producing in factories, if the consumer doesn't have purchasing power to purchase those products, then you have a crisis of overproduction. And if you are legally obligated as a CEO to protect the profits of your shareholders, and you've hit a crisis of overproduction, and you don't have global markets to sell those products, what you do to keep your company afloat is you start reducing wages, you start laying people off. And by 1927, 1928, this volcano is starting to grumble. Perhaps the greatest problem here is we're going to see Congress do something very stupid in October of 1929. In 1928, when Herbert Hoover ran for President of the United States, and the Republican Party put at the center of their platform the idea that the economic growth they were seeing in the 1920s would grow exponentially and never end. What Hoover was doing was he inspired Americans with the idea that they could get rich quick without hard work. All they had to do was invest their money, which meant in 1928, as part of their campaign promises, American citizens flocked to the polls. They voted Republican. Then they started investing their money in the stock market because they were under this naive impression that everyone was going to get rich, which unfortunately, in terms of economics, with market economy, that is not possible. But it's a nice story. What Hoover was banking upon and investors were banking upon was a tariff bill was coming up before the U.S. Senate in 1929, what's referred to as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill. Had this bill passed, what it would have done is create a fair aspect of what we call it would create unfair trade and create essentially blocks to foreign competition. What the tariff bill proposed was that any foreign products coming into American markets, the taxes on those products be increased so that American consumers would be less likely to purchase them. What they're hoping with this is to protect American industry from foreign competition, and particularly companies like RCA. RCA is the most important company in the United States in the 1920s because they have the most popular commodity outside of booze. They have radios, and everyone in the 20s is buying a radio, and they're buying them on credit. What is going to occur throughout 1929 is people start buying up stocks like crazy, hoping that this gamble pays off and that they become rich. We're going to see at the peak of this market investment in 1929, September 3rd, 1929, shares of RCA stock in modern numbers are trading for about $450 a share, which if you've ever bought stock on a stock exchange, that price is insane, and nobody can afford it. So what you do if you're an investor and you want to try and get rich is you are going to take a gamble that tariff bill is going to go through, and you borrow money to buy a stock at an overinflated price. And when news comes through on October 23rd that the Senate has defeated this tariff bill and that RCA is going to have to deal with foreign competition, investors, rightfully so, they get nervous and they pull their money out. And while market economies can grow exponentially and create a huge amount of wealth, all it takes is one investor getting slightly nervous and they can collapse the entire world economy. What's going to occur here, October 24th, people start selling off, people start panicking as the price of that stock starts plummeting. If you're an investor who has borrowed money to purchase that stock, you sell it off as quickly as possible, hoping that you can sell it off before it's completely worthless, because you still owe the debts on that money that you borrowed to purchase a stock you couldn't afford in the first place, and that now by October 29th is worthless. October 29th, what's referred to as Block Tuesday, 16.4 million shares of stock sold off in a single day of trading. And over the next week, $10 billion of wealth simply disappearing. Now, how on earth does $10 million of wealth disappear? Is it wealth is based upon security of investments and buying into the idea that that piece of stock that you bought is worth something, and a company is going to keep growing. You bought into an illusion or a fantasy. And yes, if people start panicking, they start selling off, it causes the value of things to plummet, and again, in a week, you can lose $10 billion. The money never really existed in the first place. And that share of RCA stock that you bought for $450 a share is now only worth $32. And if you bought a number of them and you borrowed money to do that, you still owe on those debts. You've just lost everything. So if you're an investor in New York City, what you do is you realize that your entire life is ruined. You'll never be able to pay those things off. So you start jumping out of the windows of skyscrapers. And when the American public hears the investors are jumping out of skyscrapers, rightfully so, they get nervous. They start showing up at banks and they start withdrawing all of their money. And if you withdraw currency from a bank, the banking system will collapse unless they can replace that currency with somebody else's money. And hence, the recall of debts in 1930s. It's going to keep American banking afloat for about a year. But yes, if you prop up your own economy by destroying another nation's economy, yeah, If that nation economy falls, that'll impact another nation. Eventually, global economic crises need global economic solutions. Unless nations work with each other, coordinate with each other, the problem with the Great Depression is every time Americans think that they're out of it and they fixed it, something that happens halfway across the world triggers panic in the market and your nation collapses once again. Beep. And welcome to the rise of a new pop culture icon named Woody Guthrie. In the 1920s, the pop culture icons were the Babe Ruths, they were the flappers, they were the fancy Hollywood actors. And now the cultural icon of America becomes a homeless hillbilly. Not hillbilly, that's not an appropriate word. A homeless farmer who lost his farm in Oklahoma, grabbed his banjo and hopped on a train and started singing songs about poor folks, such as, "This land is your land, this land is my land." Yes. A folk song written in the 1930s about the common American experience. And the awkward thing is that Woody Guthrie is perhaps the most popular musician in all of the United States. He writes a song that almost became the American national anthem, and he is an open member of the Communist Party. It's a very strange time in American history. We're going to see here with the Great Depression, it's not the first depression the United States has gone through. It certainly hasn't been the last, but it's going to be the worst economic crisis of the 20th century. At the peak, we're going to have 13 million Americans unemployed and approximately 100,000 Americans being fired from their jobs every week. Not because of lack of hard work, but because there's no investor to support that industry. And people work hard, and what are they getting for working hard? They're getting nothing. And you start having the rise of what I'd call hobo culture. These are people who had lost everything. And your solution to it is instead of giving up on life, you hop on a train and you travel around the country. You're looking for a home, looking for a job, just looking for anything, because you've come from nothing and you don't know where you're going. And Woody Guthrie, after he loses his farm in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowls, he's one of these hobos that hops on the train with his banjo and he starts documenting the songs and the stories of the American people. And this is the music that starts resonating with the American people. What we are also going to see is in major cities, since this is prior to a lot of government regulations dealing with home financing and particular things such as unemployment insurance, is that if you can't pay your bills at this time, there's no government program to assist you. You are simply evicted from your home. And if there are no jobs, what do? Is you live in the streets. And you start creating what we would associate oftentimes with third world conditions of what we call shanty towns, what people at the time referred to as Hoovervilles, particularly places like Central Park in New York City. Essentially throughout the 1930s, Central Park is, unemployed homeless people taking trash and creating their own city within the city. And for the fact there was no place to put them and nothing to do with them, New York officials simply let that phenomenon happen. And what's important to understand with all of this is that even though this might not directly impact every American family, the fear of this directly impacts every American family. Because everyone's going to know somebody who had been impacted by this, and there's always a great fear that your family might be next. Because in terms of economic collapse, you can be the hardest, most dedicated, and devout worker in the world. But if people pull their finance out of the market, it doesn't matter how hard of a worker you are, you will not succeed. And this time, not only will you not succeed, you'll be homeless, and good chances your family will starve to death. The other problem when we talk about American farmers, I'm not a scientist, I cannot explain this phenomenon, but if you're an American farmer who held on during the 1920s and you've made it to the 1930s when the Dust Bowls hit, a lot of American farmers in the areas of the Dust Bowls literally believe it is the end of times. Because if you held on to everything, you lose everything. You are quite convinced that the book of Revelation is coming true around you. And You are starting to see the rise of the armies of Christ and the Antichrist, and you're seeing natural disaster, so you prepare for the end of times. Beep. Alright, let's just spend the next couple minutes looking at some different images here to understand something about the dramatic change between the 1920s and the 1930s. This would be a stereotypical image of prosperity and consumerism in the 1920s. These are the young women that we refer to as the flappers. They're the young independent women who have independent money. They have their own political voice, and yes, if they choose motherhood, they're choosing that at a later date in life. And they are young, they are fun, and yeah, they're having a great time in the city. Beep. And when the Depression hits, this becomes the new image of America. Unemployed people standing in line, not waiting for jobs, because there are none, but seeing if people will give them a cup of coffee and a donut. And this becomes the common image throughout American cities. Beep. Quite iconic, but also ironic image here. And you can see in the background it says, "World's highest standard of living. It has a happy family and a car. There's no way like the American way." And a group of African Americans standing in front of this billboard, standing in a bread line. Because this is prior to any sort of social assistance programs, and yeah, you're relying upon private charities and donations to keep the American people from starving. Beep. On the Dust Bowls. Once again, I openly admit I know nothing about science, but based upon my knowledge of history and my knowledge of theology, between 1930 and 1940, if you lived throughout this area in the United States, yeah, you've never seen anything like this, and you're quite convinced by many, many radical preachers that the end of times has come. Beep. This isn't going to show up very well. Do some Google searches on Dust Bowl sometimes. You can see this, Stafford, Texas. You probably can't see it very well. There's a couple houses down here, and the reason we can't see it, here comes the dust. Beep. Oklahoma, 1935. What do you tell this young kid who aspired to be a farmer when he grows up? His family farm has been taken away, no longer exists. Not due to not hard working, but because of Mother Nature. Yes, this young American has no future. If he goes to the city, there are no jobs. If he wants to go in farming, there is no farm. And how do you inspire an entire generation who has had everything taken away from you? Beep. If you're a lucky person who bought a Ford truck during the 20s and you paid it off and nobody's tried to repo it, welcome to the pioneer experience, recreated with modern technology. Instead of having a horse and buggy, you take your truck, you put a little pioneer style topper on it, and you live in that truck. And you start heading west, because you keep hearing stories about in California that there's agricultural jobs. The problem is when you start hearing these stories and people keep heading out west looking for those agricultural jobs, yeah, jobs exist. But if everybody's going after them, yeah, those jobs, employers can keep wages low, they can play up race tensions, yeah, and pit unemployed person against unemployed person, and yeah, there's not much job security in California. Beep. And South Dakota. What do you tell this farmer?